So I'm at the courthouse here in downtown Santa Barbara, and I thought this would be an appropriate place to record my lectures on patients' rights. But the clock tower there, it goes off every 15 minutes or so, so sorry if that gets in the way of the lectures. Okay, so we start with the physicians, the nurses, and the other medical providers. They all tend to have a duty of beneficence. This is going to be a duty to use their medical expertise for good and to avoid harm to the patient. But this can also come into conflict with respecting the patient's autonomy. The values and the culture of the patient and the provider can clash. What's even worse is when this happens during the end-of-life decisions or about death. This is just really one of the main moral aspects of the provider-patient relationship, the others being truth-telling and confidentiality and informed consent. These are going to be chapters that we're not going to cover, but I encourage you to check them out, as I'm sure with all these chapters there's probably more in there that's interesting than you would have expected. So autonomy is a person's rational capacity for self-governance and self-determination. It's an individual's power to deliberate about available options, to freely choose among them of those possibilities and act accordingly. So a free action or an autonomous action is supposed to be one that's fully your own. These are supposed to be free from pressure or other forms of coercion. The principle of autonomy can be stated as an autonomous person should be allowed to exercise their capacity for self-determination. Sometimes autonomy can be violated, but when we do that, we need to have very good reasons and we need to make those justifications explicit. So medicine has developed the practice of informed consent. Still, limitation of a person's autonomy can be physical or psychological, subtle or obvious, justified or unjustified, generally accepted or widely controversial. So here's a couple of different cases. Physicians physically restraining a patient obviously is going to violate their autonomy, but also so is misinforming them about seriousness of their illness. So lying to a patient is also violating their autonomy. It's treating them as a means to an end. And the end there is, making it easier for you to explain this to them. So another instance of violating someone's autonomy is forcing a healthy woman to have a hysterectomy. That's an obvious instance of coercion. Using false information to persuade her to have the operation is a subtler kind of compulsion, but it's also usually seen as impermissible. We tend to think of that physicians are sometimes justified in confining and treating a mentally ill man who's a danger to himself or others, but we would think that it would not be justified if the man were perfectly healthy and competent. Now, giving a 12-year-old a blood transfusion to save her life seems like a normal medical practice, but withholding transfusions because her parents say that it's an affront to their religious faith is very controversial. So whenever the principles of beneficence and autonomy are in conflict, we need to talk about paternalism. Historically, paternalism was a normal part of the medical practice. It started back with the Hippocratic Oath. The doctors have an obligation to do what's best for the patient. But the tides have been changing over the last few decades. There have been more of an emphasis on patients having the right to be more informed about their medical care, their treatment options, and they have the right to refuse any treatment they want. So the textbook looks at one divide between kinds of paternalism, weak versus strong paternalism. Weak paternalism refers to paternalism directed at people who cannot act autonomously or whose autonomy is greatly diminished. For example, someone who's dangerously psychotic, severely retarded, extremely depressed, or acutely addicted. So weak paternalism is generally thought to be not wrong for two reasons. In these situations, it's not usually considered an objectionable violation of autonomy because patients are already substantially non-autonomous to some degree. Which means that we're not really violating their autonomy because they're not necessarily autonomous in the first place. So also, generally it's thought to be morally acceptable because of its purposes. So the reasons why we're using weak paternalism are either usually to protect people from harm while they are non-autonomous, to determine whether they are in fact non-autonomous, or to restore them to full autonomy. So think like an addict, you're trying to get them back to normal, a place where they can start acting autonomously. Strong paternalism is going to be the overriding of a person's actions or choices even though they are substantially autonomous. So cases involving strong paternalism often provoke debate and sometimes also legal wrangling. So consider a man who normally behaves autonomously and rationally, but he's involuntarily committed to a mental institution because he occasionally becomes confused and disoriented, and the doctors fear that he might become a threat to himself or to others. A physician might discover that a patient has a malignant breast tumor, but because he knows that she is terrified of the disease, he tells her that the tumor is benign, but still that the tumor should be surgically removed just in case. So that would be an instance of lying or misleading in an instance where you're trying to protect the patient. But then the woman the other situation is a woman who needs a life-saving blood transfusion, refuses it on religious grounds, but when she lapses into a coma, the surgeons operate and give her the transfusion anyway. So these scenarios and many others play out more often than you think, and they're going to prompt more than just ethical debates. They're also going to prompt a lot of people to have personal and professional anguish. Generally, some views that people have towards paternalism, this is not necessarily strong versus weak paternalism, but just paternalism in general. Generally, people are anti-paternalism. They usually agree that some acts of weak paternalism are okay, but most of them, generally, people are going to reject almost all forms of strong paternalism. The general argument is that strong paternalism is wrong because it violates the rights of the persons to determine for themselves what is good and what is right. People are sovereigns over their own lives, and it's important not to violate that sovereignty. So sovereignty is just a fancy word for like self-governance. Others, though, are more willing to allow some acts of strong paternalism on the ground that the person involved would consent if the circumstances were ideal. So, say if the person were to be thinking more rationally. These thinkers, for example, might think that it's okay to commit a substantially autonomous person to a mental institution involuntarily if he's having trouble living independently and he might become a danger to himself. So that would just be like someone who's old and maybe they can't walk as much, and so we're involuntarily forcing them to live in a home where they can get more care, because if they were to live on their own, then maybe they would fall and hurt themselves, and they couldn't get help in a timely manner, so that would be a danger to themselves. But the big problem with this approach is that it's really hard to talk about like ideal circumstances. When is a person thinking rationally? When is a person not thinking rationally? One of the challenging instances is something like an adaptive preference. So people who live in an environment where they have been forced to live a certain way, after a while they start to adapt to that preference and they start to think this is what I actually prefer, even though maybe they don't. So it's really hard to talk about this ideal circumstance. If a person were thinking rationally, what does that even mean? Okay, so then others are going to argue that only satisfactory justification for paternalism is not the consent of the person, but the beneficence. So intervening simply on on behalf of someone else's welfare. So on this view, the benefits of paternalistic actions must be balanced against the importance of respecting autonomy. Actions that minimally restrict autonomy might benefit the person greatly, would be justified. And on the other hand, actions that seriously violate autonomy while offering minimal benefits would not be acceptable. So the idea here is we just need to do the calculation. Is violating their autonomy going to have a greater benefit than not violating their autonomy? But again, what's not important here is the actual consent of the individual, what the individual would consent to under different circumstances. What matters is what is actually good for the patient. Okay, so paternalism is super broad, there's a lot of different ways. So we were just looking at weak versus strong paternalism, but there's other ways of dividing this up. So this is information coming from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on paternalism, just different ways of trying to divide it up. So we have hard paternalism and soft paternalism. This is going to be the idea that we're allowed to interfere with someone's actions, but only to make sure that they're fully aware themselves. So Mill gives us this instance of a person who's going to walk across a damaged bridge. We have a right to stop them. So now the soft paternalist is going to say, we have a right to stop them to make sure that they know it's a damaged bridge and they know what's going to happen. And if they're still fully aware and they're like, yeah, I'm fine with that and I'd be cool if I, died, then that's cool. They're allowed to proceed. But the hard paternalist is going to say, no. Even if you stop them, you ask them, you explain that the bridge is dangerous and they still want to go on it anyway, the hard paternalist is going to say, we, in that instance, have a right to violate their autonomy, physically restrain them from trying to kill themselves. So broad versus narrow paternalism. Narrow paternalism is concerned with the question about like state coercion and legal coercion, whereas broad paternalism is going to be concerned with things beyond just the state action. So institutional things like a hospital policy, or individuals trying to act paternalistically on others. Now, another way of thinking about weak versus strong paternalism is the ends versus the means. So again, let's say your end is you believe that safety is preferable to convenience. But the way you're going about it, the way you're living your life, is not actually reflecting that value. So a weak paternalist might think, okay, yeah, we are allowed to do things that actually force you to, hold up to the values you say you hold. Now, a strong paternalist, on the other hand, might think that someone has mistaken or irrational ends, and so it's okay to interfere with those persons who are trying to achieve things that are irrational. So yeah, even if the person prefers the wind in their hair over safety, we still might legitimately be allowed to require wearing a helmet while riding a motorcycle, because this end of convenience over safety is irrational or mistaken in some way. That's going to be a strong paternalism point of view. So if one is a weak but not a strong paternalist, they might think that only interfering with mistakes about facts, but not mistakes about values. So this is an interesting way of thinking about it. If a person tries to jump out a window because they believe that they're going to float gently to the ground, we may restrain them. But if he jumps because he believes that it's important to be spontaneous, we may not. So obviously, there's a difference in the fact in the first one, like you're not going to float safely to the ground. So it's all right, we may restrain him in that instance. But, if he values spontaneity and thinking that jumping out the window is the best thing to do to prove spontaneity, then yeah, maybe that person we can't interfere with. That would be a weak paternalist, not a strong paternalist point of view. So there's also pure versus impure paternalism. This is going to be really simply, are we interfering with the people who we're actually protecting, or are we interfering with someone else's autonomy to protect other people? So think about it like this. Impure paternalism is an instance of regulating smoking and regulating things like that, not because it's good for the regulator or not good for the cigarette makers or even the people who smoke the cigarettes, but it's good for the non-smokers that they don't smoke. That's how that paternalism is working there. That's going to be an impure form of paternalism, because you're limiting the rights of people that you're not protecting. But again, it's still paternalism because you're doing it for their benefit. Now, impure or pure paternalism is going to be something like preventing swimmers from swimming when there is no lifeguard present. So this is, you're protecting the class from their own actions. You're not, interfering with someone else's actions. So there's also a difference between moral paternalism and welfare paternalism. So welfare paternalism is going to be the idea that it's okay to interfere with someone's choices to improve that person's moral character, but as a way of also improving their well-being as well. So think about someone who is an addict who's also stealing things. So maybe we can interfere with their lives, make them a better person. But it also, getting rid of this addiction is also going to help their well-being as well. Now, on the other hand, moral welfare Moral paternalism is just the idea of interfering with someone's life to make them a better person. Now, even if this isn't going to result in them having a better overall life. So now, suppose that we interfere with a person who is a prostitute. They are making a decent living, they're able to support themselves and maybe even their dependents. But they're doing something that might be considered morally wrong. They're selling their bodies for, sex. So yeah, we might think that it's okay to intervene there and not allow them to be prostitutes because they're doing something wrong, and they're going to be better people if they don't. But are they going to be living overall better lives? That's kind of questionable. Maybe the only other job they can get is as a server at a restaurant, and they're definitely going to be struggling to get by. So yeah, that's going to be the difference there between like helping someone for their moral character that is also going to have an impact in their well-being, and just helping someone to be a better person, even if it's not going to have an overall positive impact in their life. Okay, now there's a difference here between like moral welfare and legal moralism. Now, the idea is that like we should outlaw things because they're just straight up immoral, not because they're good for anyone's benefit. So think about the, they call it a sport of like dwarf tossing. And the idea is that the dwarfs were all, fully participants. They were fully informed. They were wearing helmets. They weren't aware of, or they weren't getting injured. It wasn't, bad for them. So we're not actually trying to protect the dwarves, but we might make this sport illegal because it's something that's, immoral. And so that's going to be something slightly different. Legal moralism is going to be different than, moral paternalism. Again, and paternalism is because it has to, for it to count as paternalism, it has to be done for someone's benefit, even if they are or aren't, agreeing that it's for their benefit. That's what makes it paternalistic. So sometimes a patient is going to refuse treatment, and this probably isn't going to make sense to you. So the question then becomes, is it ever morally permissible for a physician to treat a patient against their will? If so, what justifies this action, and under what conditions is it ever acceptable? It wasn't until the 1980s that the question about a competent patient's right to refuse treatment had really become settled. Very roughly, a competent patient is an autonomous person who's able to make decisions about their treatment. So in some situations, the patients were thought to have no right to decline recommended treatment. One example was a mother in labor. She was forced to have a C-section because of complications to the baby. Another instance that it was common to not respect the patient's autonomy was if the person had dependents, so children who depended on them. Courts sent it aside with the physicians and permitted treatment against the patient's will. So later court rulings overturned these decisions and set the foundations for patients to have the right to reject life-saving treatments. There has definitely been a shift away from the physician's beneficence towards the patient's autonomy. Autonomy can also be respected even when the patient isn't competent. So this is through the advanced directives. Healthcare workers and family members can still respect your autonomy by following what you've written down in your advanced directive. So respecting a patient's right to refuse treatment makes sense for a competent adult, but what about a child? Does a child have the right to refuse treatment? Maybe as they grow older, sometime around 15 to 18, maybe they gain the right to refuse treatment when they become what's known as a mature minor. But what if it's the parents doing the deciding for the child? So let's consider this case of the 12-year-old Ian Lunsman from Minneapolis, who died May 9th, 1989, after slipping into a diabetic coma. His diabetes had remained medically untreated, his mother and stepfather foregoing insulin in favor of prayers from a Christian Scientist practitioner. So Christian Scientists believe that disease is a spiritual disorder requiring spiritual healing, not medical treatment. So here is another typical scenario. A 6-year-old girl is seriously injured in a traffic accident, and the only way to save her life is to give her a blood transfusion. But her Jehovah's Witness parents reject this because the procedure is explicitly forbidden by their faith. So typically what happens in these situations is the physician proceeds with the transfusion and saves the girl's life, and the parents usually end up suing the physician or the hospital in the end. So on the one hand, these patients insist that they have the right to decide what's best for their children, and they sincerely believe that what they're doing is best for their child is to avoid medical interventions. So it's things like, I genuinely believe that my child's soul will not go to heaven if you give them this blood transfusion. So they're really just demanding the right to freely practice their religious beliefs as they see fit. On the other hand, many people do not think that they should have the right to bring serious harm to their children, especially when the children cannot decide for themselves. The Supreme Court sums this up with their ruling. Parents may become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children. So again, this becomes even more complicated as the child becomes a mature minor. In some legal cases, the minor's autonomy is respected, while in other ones it's not. So for example, a judge has ruled that a 15-year-old Jehovah's Witness girl dying of leukemia could refuse a blood transfusion to save her life, but a 16-year-old boy injured in a train accident could not decline a transfusion needed to save his life during surgery. So regardless of the situation, regardless of the religion, regardless of what's going on, common medical practice suggests that physicians and nurses should step in if they think that a child's welfare is at stake. So this ethical dilemma can be flipped on its head. Sometimes the patient might be the one requesting a treatment from a physician, and often from beneficent motives, the physician does not want to provide it. The conflict is between the patient's autonomy and what the physician thinks constitutes morally acceptable care. So the most dramatic and heart-wrenching of these cases is about supplying end-of-life care. Consider the story of 85-year-old Helga Wangley, who in 1990 suddenly had to be placed on a ventilator because of serious breathing problems. Over the following weeks, her condition worsened, and she sank into unconsciousness and then into a persistent vegetative state. She received round-the-clock, life-sustaining treatment consisting of ventilators, antibiotics, feeding tubes, and other measures. Her physicians told Helga's husband and two children that the treatment was not helping and it should be stopped. Her family, on the other hand, demanded that the treatment be continued. They hoped that a miracle would happen and asserted that Helga is not better off dead and that the physician should not be playing God. Her husband claimed that Helga had never expressed an opinion about life-sustaining treatment herself. So another team of physicians came in and confirmed the view of the first ones. They thought that the ventilator was non-beneficial because it was not easing Helga's suffering, it was not repairing her body, and it was not helping her experience life. So the struggle continued, and it eventually moved into the courts, but the decision would not be resolved there. 3 days after it moved into the courts, Helga had passed away. So this dilemma is known as medical futility. Medical futility is the alleged pointlessness or ineffectiveness of administering particular treatment. Generally, physicians think that a treatment is futile and so it should be stopped or not continued. And on the other hand, the patient or the family might reject the label of futility, and they might request that everything that can be done be done. So generally, the patients and the physicians are thinking about futility differently. The physicians might determine a treatment is futile if they cannot achieve a specified physiological benefit. For example, the treatment was not going to repair damaged tissue, it's not going to restore functioning, or it's not going to ease suffering. The patient or the family might be thinking about treatment as futile only if it cannot keep the body alive. So physicians generally follow this principle that physicians are not obligated to provide treatment that is inconsistent with reasonable standards of medical practice. For example, a physician is not morally obligated to help a patient who requests that his leg be amputated for no reason, or someone who demands an injection of worthless and dangerous cancer remedies. The idea is that not every patient request must be regarded as legitimate, and not every medical technology must be supplied. So often when physicians find themselves in this dilemma, there's a way of coming to an agreement. So pretty much the surrogates and the physicians, or whoever's in the debate, are going to set a reasonable date, and they're going to cease treatment if there's no sign of improvement by that reasonable date. But often these situations can change if the surrogate or the patient change their mind, or if the patient dies before that date. So these clashes are often strongest between physicians who argue, physicians and the patients who argue for the sanctity of life. So they tend to think that the body should be kept alive at all costs. They are generally not moved by the claim that the treatment is not giving the patient any benefit. So one argument against this position is that it makes little sense to treat the body of a person when that person no longer exists. But I don't know. I don't think that people who really argue for the sanctity of life are going to be convinced of that. I don't think that they're going to say that that person no longer exists. They're going to look at the body and point at the body and say, this is still existing. This is still here. This person is still alive. So we need to be doing something here. So one of the more topical questions lately has been about the ethics of vaccine refusals and respecting autonomy. So is it ever permissible to override an individual's autonomy to mandate them to get a vaccine? That's kind of the question. So we looked at an article earlier in the year talking about the ethics of vaccine refusals. This was Kowalk's article, and some of his arguments relied on the principle of autonomy. I tried to leave the argument implicit and let the efficiency and safety of the vaccine numbers speak for themselves. But recently, I had a conversation with a friend about the Canadian truck drivers in Detroit, and I thought it would be good for me to, explicitly uncouple this idea of autonomy and vaccine mandates. So I looked around and I found some stuff, but one of the more interesting things was the article that Kowalk cites that he's actually arguing against. So that was Jason Brennan's article, A Libertarian Case for Mandatory Vaccinations. So Brennan approaches it from a libertarian point of view to see if he can justify vaccine mandates. Because if he can justify vaccine mandates on libertarian grounds, then it seems like he can also justify it on pretty much any other political framework. So before we get started, one thing that we all need to agree on is that the vaccine that we're talking about is highly effective, that it has low instances of side effects, that it protects against serious illness, and that evidence for A through C is strong and widely available, such that the overwhelming majority of people who might dispute A through C would be unjustified and epistemically irrational for doing so. Okay, so I'm not going to argue with these if you don't think that the vaccine is safe, if you don't think that there have been low instances of side effects, and if you don't think that a vaccine protects against serious illness, then either you are reading, the wrong thing, you are misreading it, you're being misinformed. But the point here with D is that if you don't accept this, then you are being irrational. So yeah, that's the thing. The numbers, the effectiveness should really just be speaking for itself. Okay, so he first then explains the libertarian framework that he's working from. He's drawing a lot from Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, but he also thinks about libertarian from a few different points of view. Brennan himself is a libertarian, so he's trying to advocate for this point of view itself. And yeah, he definitely believes in the Lockean foundations of of libertarianism. So his article here starts with a brief explanation of about how neither unconditional rights, specifically things about autonomy or paternalism, are going to justify vaccine mandates or not justify vaccine mandates on a libertarian framework. These are going to be two non-starter arguments. These are going to be arguments that he just thinks are no good and he puts them aside. Okay, so generally libertarians believe that everyone has an exhaustive set of negative civil and economic rights. Okay, so briefly, there's positive rights. These are rights to things, a claim right, like I own my car, I have a right to my car. But then we have negative rights. These are going to be a right not to be interfered with. So you can think about it as positive, like a right to something, and negative as a right not to be interfered. So some libertarians think that rights are absolute, but most do not. So rarely do they think that these rights can be overridden to prevent disasters. So let's consider an example. A madman is loose in the town, and you know that he has a nuclear bomb and he's ready to set it off. And you, and only you, are the person who has the ability to stop that madman from blowing up the city. Now the question is, would you be justified in taking someone else's car, a stranger's car? Most people think that you would be justified in taking that car even if the owner protests. Normally you would not be justified in taking the car because you need it, even if you're trying to do something good, like going to volunteer at the homeless shelter. You're still not going to be justified in taking the car. The point is that most people agree that there's at least some circumstances where the reasons for taking the car are so demanding that they can outweigh others' claimed rights against you. So as long as you're not an absolutist about rights, meaning that there's not a single reason to ever override an individual's rights, then Brennan argues that it's relatively easy to justify mandatory vaccines on a libertarian framework. So that's what he's going to try and argue. But again, you're going to have to set aside this idea that not all rights are absolute. But even most libertarians agree with that. So maybe this was, when I was going over Kowalek's argument, maybe this was a big thing. It seemed like he thinks that the right to autonomy is an absolute right, and that just doesn't make sense. It also isn't one of these all or nothing kind of rights. It's one of those things that we can, diminish someone's autonomy partly, but not completely. So yeah, he just had a very different view about the right to autonomy, and I think that makes his arguments a little bit weaker and definitely more difficult to follow. So Brennan gives us the avoiding disaster trumps rights argument. So premise one, while an individual has strong presumptive rights to refuse medications, these rights are not absolute. They can be overridden to prevent disasters. Premise two, it would be a disaster if no one or if a large majority of individuals failed to receive various vaccinations against dangerous illnesses. Conclusion, therefore, it is permissible to force individuals to receive certain vaccinations against dangerous illnesses. So this argument isn't focusing on any particular vaccine or any particular illness that it's trying to cause. The point of this argument is to show that, look, there is at least some instances when it is permissible to override an individual's autonomy, specifically with giving them, a vaccine, giving them medicine. So think about this any zombie apocalypse movie like 28 Days Later or World War Z. Now think that the government could stop the spread of the zombie virus by mandating vaccines. At least this is a kind of disaster where vaccine mandates would be justified. But luckily we are not fighting the zombie virus, but the point of this thought experiment is to demonstrate that vaccine mandates can still be justified on a libertarian framework. Now, it's worth pointing out that this article was published in 2018, and Brennan was worried about hesitancy around measles, mumps, and rubella, or the MMR vaccine. He is not talking anything about the outbreaks, he's admitting that those outbreaks that were happening did not necessarily constitute a rights-trumping disaster. He doesn't say anything about COVID because it was before we knew anything about COVID. But it still seems like COVID is somewhere between the zombie virus and outbreaks that maybe only have killed a few innocent children. The point is that these individual rights, specifically their right to autonomy, is not absolute. There are circumstances that can override the right to autonomy, specifically even with vaccine mandates. So does COVID constitute an emergency? That might be one way of approaching this and, trying to justify this argument and saying that, we do have a right to mandate these vaccines. But Brennan doesn't really think that's a promising way, and so he's going to leave it there. Again, he was thinking about the outbreaks that were happening with measles, mumps, and rubella. So he might have said something else different if we were talking about COVID in particular. If COVID is a disaster that trumps the rights of individuals, then that would be enough to justify these mandates. But again, he's going to say that that's not, and so he's going to go on to try and justify it in other ways. So libertarians think that we must respect a competent adult's rights to make stupid, self-destructive choices, even if these choices are by their very nature stupid and self-destructive. Libertarians might accept that a government or other agencies should advertise vaccines, their effectiveness or safety, and they might even agree that a doctor has the right to refuse a patient on their vaccine status. But libertarians would definitely stop short of requiring adults to get vaccinated. Again, he has the MMR vaccine in mind, and it might be sufficiently different with COVID. It might be okay in that situation because we're not trying to protect the children, we're trying to protect the adults. So the MMR vaccines are actually more ethically complicated because, again, we're trying to vaccinate children. Libertarians might not think that paternalism can justify mandating adults to get vaccinated, but it is more complicated when we're talking about whether the state can mandate the parents have their children vaccinated. So part of the argument is that we need to determine what sorts of negative rights children have, and plus the positive rights that they might hold against their guardians. We also need to determine to what degree the state and the child's guardians have the right to say what happens over the child. So you might think that parents definitely always have the final absolute right in how they raise their child. And yeah, maybe, but there's also definitely circumstances where they don't. So if a parent isn't feeding their child, the state absolutely has the right to step in. If a parent is physically abusing their child, again, the state has a right to step in. So yes, parents most of the time have the right to determine how their children live their lives, but definitely not always and in all circumstances and with all things. So either way, vaccine mandates are complicated by the fact that this is largely a collective action problem. The point is that herd immunity, this is the point about herd immunity. It's not literally true that a particular child must be vaccinated to protect that child from their disease. Rather, what matters is that a sufficiently high percentage of the population is vaccinated. So I'm not going to be able to go through the rest of the argument here. It's a really good one, and I definitely think that you should check it out. I'm going to sketch the rest of it, but I just wanted to emphasize again that the point is that neither autonomy nor paternalism are going to be good arguments in this vaccine mandate. So autonomy isn't going to allow you to opt out of vaccine mandates, and paternalism isn't always going to justify that vaccine mandates be used. So again, Brennan's going to look for something else to justify vaccine mandates on this libertarian framework. So on the libertarian framework, we are still allowed to harm others sometimes. This is like in self-defense. This could definitely still justify something like Thompson's abortion article. Still, though, we're not allowed to harm each other whenever we want on a libertarian framework. We're usually prevented from initiating violence, poisoning another person, or committing fraud. So the question is, is spreading an infectious disease one of these kinds of harms that we're allowed to prevent people from, committing on others from a libertarian framework? So Brennan's going to present this argument from, imposing unjust risk of harm to others. And so he's going to say that this argument is going to be strong enough to justify vaccine mandates. Okay, so premise one, it is wrong to impose unjust risk of harm on others. Premise two, public health interventions that interfere with an individual's right to prevent the individual from imposing unjust risk of harm to others are permissible. Premise three, vaccine mandates are a safe and effective way of preventing individuals from imposing unjust risk of harm to another. So the conclusion here, thus a mandatory vaccination that prevents individuals from imposing an unjust risk of harm to another are permissible. Okay, so I need to spell out here what an unjust risk of harm is to another person. So to make sense of this, we're going to need to think of an analogous case. One where someone is shooting their gun into the air, maybe even in celebration. So, there's like a celebratory gunfire is what it's called. So Jessica Flanagan gives us this argument by analogy between celebratory gunfire and the non-vaccinators. So in the case of celebratory gunfire, the non-vaccinators harm and impose risk on their neighbors. In both cases, the shooter and the non-vaccinator may never see the harm they cause on others. Both the shooter and the non-vaccinator may feel justified in exposing people to small amounts of risk of getting shot or infected with a contagious illness for the sake of their own freedom to fire guns and refuse vaccinations. Yet, neither the shooter nor the non-vaccinators' right entitle them to harm others, despite the fact that the harm is of relatively low probability, their victims are unlikely to identify them, and they do not intend to injure their victims. So there are going to be plenty of disanalogies here between vaccinations and celebratory gunfires, each of which Flanagan is going to probe, finding that either the difference isn't present or they're not morally relevant. One of the interesting points, though, is about herd immunity that results from vaccinations, and how this is largely a collective action problem. So most people are not purposely infecting others. Many times those who carry and pass on the infectious disease are simply unaware that they're doing so. So in a collective action problem, individuals as individuals are unimportant. So we can rarely point to an individual parent and say, your refusal to vaccinate your kid caused another child to get sick. In general, individual decisions on vaccines or to get vaccinated or not to get vaccinated are going to have negligible effects on others. No matter what most people do, it's not really going to, or it doesn't really matter what any individual does. What really matters is what most people do. So to think about this, Brennan is going to propose what's known as the clean hands principle. So this is the idea that we are morally obligated to not participate in harmful collective actions. So this is going to be a principle that he thinks libertarians can justify, but also just any ethical framework, utilitarianism, deontology, liberalism, any one of these frameworks is definitely still going to agree with the clean hands principle. So to make sense of this, let me give you an example here. So suppose that there are 10 snipers who are going to shoot an innocent child. But before they do, they offer you a rifle and allow you to join in. Now, most people think that you should not join in, even if the situation is what they call overdetermined. This means that it's going to happen regardless of what you do. You still should not participate in shooting that innocent child. So the same thing is happening here with COVID. Even if you can't be pointed to as blameworthy, and even though the action might happen regardless of whether you get vaccinated or not, it still doesn't mean that you don't have an obligation to get vaccinated. You should, try and avoid these situations where you're going to have dirty hands. That's the point. So we're talking about unjust risks. So what is an unjust risk as opposed to a just risk? This is something that's hard to tease apart, and it's something that anyone should have an idea of. But to give you a little basic idea, let me demonstrate again. So it might be that where we cause risk when we're just driving down the street, but that risk is not something that's going to stop me from doing something. So that's probably going to be a justifiable risk. But again, so what's the difference here between a justifiable and an unjustifiable risk? Okay, well, let's compare these two scenarios. Let's just say, for ease of comparison, that it's like a 1 in a million chance that you're going to kill an innocent person while driving a car. Now, let's just say that I put a bomb on the street and I set it to have a 1 in a million random chance at exploding, and it could kill an innocent person. Now, both of those are going to have the exact same risk here, 1 in a million, but one of those is going to be a justifiable risk and one of them is going to be an unjustifiable risk. So one way of teasing this apart is to think about the benefits involved. So when there's a justifiable risk, at least the people involved are getting some benefit, whereas this unjustifiable risk, it doesn't seem like anyone's getting any kind of benefit here. So the bomb on the side of the street that's going to have the 1 in a million chance of exploding, is that going to solve anything? Is that going to help anyone? And if the answer is no, then it seems like, well, exposing anyone to that risk is just going to be unjustifiable. Okay, so now we're going to turn to what's known as the government failure objection. So we had 4 assumptions we had earlier. A, that these vaccines are highly effective. B, that they have a low incidence of side effects. C, that they protect against serious illness. And D, that evidence for A through C is strong and widely available. Now, you might think that there's another assumption that I'm kind of smuggling in here about the government. E, when a government is imbued with the power to force people to accept vaccines, it will use that power in a just, competent, and public-spirited way. Now, the government's super divided right now. Politics is very divisive. I don't want to say that one party is better than the other, or that one party would or wouldn't abuse this. But what Brennan does is he goes back and he looks at the history of government failures and tries to make this argument in this way. So Brennan says, in the abstract, the government objection might be powerful, but it does not obviously justify rejecting all government powers. Even the major proponents of the government failure argument agree. The point of identifying the main sources of government failure is not to say that governments fail severely all the time. Rather, the point is to caution political thinkers to weigh government successes against government failures, as well as market successes against market failures. Public choice theory recommends a cautious approach to imbuing governments with power. Programs should generally start small and be scaled up only as it becomes clear that the government failure will not be sufficiently bad. So the point is that yes, the government might abuse this power and authority at some point, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't give the government power and authority at all. We should just be cautious and still be wary of it. So we should start small and scale up as they're succeeding or making sure that the government isn't abusing this power. Now, in COVID situations, it might be a little bit different here. There might be exceptions for emergency powers, temporarily given to a president or a governor, things like that. But that's going to take us down a well that I'm not interested in going down, so I'm just going to leave that there. Brennan, on the other hand, looks at the history of government failures. So he says, while I take the government failure argument seriously, historically it appears that mandatory vaccination regimens work extremely well, and the government failures in this particular endeavor are relatively minor. While there is a vast literature showing ample rent-seeking in, for example, agricultural policies and even in other aspects of medicine, I could find no papers showing serious rent-seeking in mandatory vaccinations. Thus, the objection is not strong enough to prohibit mandatory vaccinations. So the point is that historically there haven't been abuses of power with mandatory vaccinations. So that argument is reasonable and we should keep it in the back of our minds, but so far we haven't actually had any government abuses to be concerned about. So in the end, Brennan's going to say that mandatory vaccinations are justifiable from libertarian principles. These are, again, not going to be paternalistic grounds. Instead, the argument is justified on the grounds that individuals may be stopped from participating in the collective imposition of unjust harm on others. So since these vaccines can be mandatorily required on libertarian grounds, the case in favor of vaccines must be very strong. So this is going to be Brennan's argument here. So now we're going to talk about the major ethical theories. And first we're going to start with utilitarianism. Generally, the theory is grounded in the principle of beneficence. Utilitarianism demands that we maximize the good for everyone involved. This is going to be a requirement that may justify paternalistic actions. So to promote the greatest good for the patient, that is to minimize the suffering and to maximize the well-being, a physician or nurse may think that sometimes it's permissible to breach confidentiality or mislead the patient about their condition or proposed treatments. They could also think that it's permissible to override a patient's autonomy to refuse a treatment for their own good. And finally, on general utilitarian grounds, a physician can reject a patient's request for futile treatment. So within utilitarianism, we've talked about this before, we have different types. So the main division is between act versus rule utilitarianism. So in act utilitarianism, the rightness of an action depends on the relative good produced by the individual action. In rule utilitarianism, rightness depends on the good maximized by rules governing the category of the actions. So on act utilitarian grounds, a physician may judge that it's morally permissible to lie to the patient and about the benefits of the treatment to overcome the patient's refusal to get the treatment. On rule utilitarian, a physician may judge that in the long run, lies do more harm than good because they erode the public's trust in the medical profession. The idea is that it's better to adhere to the rule, barring deceit, as a means of getting patients to accept the treatment. So they may also differ in their estimates of the probabilities involved and the ideas about the nature of the goods that are being maximized. So John Stuart Mill is one proponent of utilitarianism. However, he's going to reject most forms of paternalism. Mill thought that the principle of utility implied a strong respect for individual self-determination and proposed what's known as the harm principle. This is the idea that no one may interfere with a person's liberty except for to prevent harm to others. In one of his famous works on liberty, Mill says, "A person cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it is better for him to do so. Because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others to do so would be wise and even right." So on Mill's version of utilitarianism, people can decide what they want to do with their own bodies, they can refuse treatment, and they must be given informed consent. So Kantian deontology, Kantian ethics would reject most forms of paternalism. According to the Kantian ethical framework, we must respect individuals' autonomy. Specifically, we must resist utilitarian calculations and acting on the patient's behalf. Lying or misleading or withholding information from the patient would be treating them as a mere means instead of as an end in themselves. And informed consent would always be required on this view. The physicians must respect the patient's decisions to refuse treatment, even if that treatment is going to be life-saving. In terms of futile treatment, Kantian would argue that withholding treatment would be permissible, that forcing the physician to treat the patient would violate the physician's autonomy. So now, I didn't see much on Kant about instances where we are allowed to violate individuals' autonomy. So I'm thinking like the harm principle. Is there anything that Kant would say in comparison? Specifically with vaccine mandates. So I emailed one of the Kantian professors here at UCSB, and I asked him, and apparently there is the states are the ones who have the right to coercively force people to do things. So in most of his normative ethics, Kant is talking about individuals acting towards other individuals. No individual has a right to enforce paternalistic actions on others. But the state, according to Kant, it would have the moral authority to force certain paternalistic actions on individuals. And that could be even something as simple as, coordination laws, like everyone has to drive on the right side of the road. So yeah, even though Kantian, the ethics here might not allow us to, act paternalistically, it doesn't forbid the government from acting paternalistically. Okay, so finally, we have the natural law theory. This approach is open to more forms of paternalism. So remember that on the euthanasia debate, it is not permissible for the patient to get a lethal injection or to have life-sustaining treatment stopped. But a hopelessly ill patient has the right to refuse extraordinary life-sustaining treatments. These are going to be measures that can cause more suffering or hardship and offer no medical benefits. Okay, so today we've been talking about the patient's rights. We've been talking about their autonomy, what their autonomy is, when it should be respected, when it shouldn't be. We talked about how autonomy can conflict with the principles of beneficence, and when autonomy and beneficence are going to conflict, we need to be looking at paternalism. We looked at hard versus soft paternalism, narrow versus broad paternalism, weak versus strong, pure versus impure, moral versus welfare paternalism. So yeah, those are going to be different ways of trying to resolve these conflicts between autonomy and beneficence. But then yeah, we also looked at the patient's rights to refuse treatments, the physician's right to, not give futile treatments, and the ethical complications there. So then we look back at autonomy and how that and paternalism are going to be just straight up non-starters in the vaccine debate. But rather, Brennan ultimately justifies the vaccine mandates on the clean hand principle from the libertarian point of view. And again, it's the idea that an individual may be stopped from participating in collectively imposing unjust risk of harm to others. Yeah, so those are going to be some of the more interesting topical points about patients' rights. There's going to be more about patients' rights, but yeah, so that's what we got for today, and I will see you guys in class on actions that are going to collectively cause harm to others. So think about a situation of collective harm. So there are 10 snipers who are going to shoot an innocent child. But before they do shoot that innocent child, they offer you a rifle and allow you to join in. Most people agree that you should not join in. Even though the action is overdetermined, it's going to happen regardless. You should not participate in the shooting of an innocent child. It's always wrong to shoot an innocent child, even if you know that there are 10 other people who are also trying to shoot that child at the same time. Okay, so that's going to be the clean hands principle. We have a moral obligation to not participate in those kinds of actions.